with our foreign policy. Invading Iraq, no, because we were the good guys. Afghanistan, numbers of deaths, well, you know, we're still good guys, and it's just, unfortunately, collateral damage. It's just that, you know, they have a problem with democracy, they have a problem with human rights, they have a problem with capitalism, etc. And I used to say to people, that's right. You know, a lot of my friends, when I go to that part of the world, you know, and many of them, I mean, one of the things we discuss over dinner is how fortunate they are that they don't have to vote, or that if they do vote, they already know the outcome, so they don't have to vote. And you know, I said, my friends always tell me, God, it's so good. I don't have to spend all my time reading newspapers, watching TV, wondering who's right and wrong, dealing with all those hard problems, healthcare, freedom, Social Security. I don't deal with any of that. That's taken care of by the government. You know, I mean, there's no problem. And economically, sure, I hate capitalism. I'm very happy with the, you know, the way things are. Entrenched elites, growing gap between rich and poor, a high rate of corruption. But, you know, I'm happy. Why would I want the good things in life? You know, why would I want a good car? Why would I want my kids to have a good future, etc.? I have to work so much harder, long hours. This way, you have no future, so you just sort of show up, smoke a cigarette, get through the day, you know, etc. I mean, you know, when you really play it out in terms of just practical human beings, the desires of most of us here, the feeling that we want to feel that there's some future, even if many of us feel we don't have quite the future to have Air Force One. I'm going to weep now, so it hurts me so bad. But anyway, I will never have Air Force One. I won't have my own plane, okay? I got to live with that, but I do know I have a bit of a future. But I mean, that reality, not to realize it, and now to see how people want to seize that day. But how do we respond? That becomes the real question. How do we come to realize that what we're seeing in this broad-based, anti-dictatorship, pro-greater democratization movement is something that has been confirmed in major polling more recently, so we know it has real roots. How do we begin to see how to move forward? How do we realize that we have to realize that we're still operating in an area where there's been a double standard, that we're still operating in an area where too often we saw public diplomacy under the Bush administration and even continuing to be, well, they just don't know us and understand us. If they just did, things would be okay. But never felt that we had to deal with foreign policy. When you look at hard data, both people in the Arab and Muslim world and in America actually admire the same things about the US. Technology, economic development. Okay? The very things we take great pride in, so do they. The very things we fear, extremism and terrorism, so do they. The very things that we need, that we say could improve things, greater knowledge of each other, exchange programs, so do they. But where there's a significant difference is, we in the data never move to the issue of foreign policy. Whereas the other side says, in order to make things better, it's not just exchange programs, etc. It's that you've got to walk the way you talk. It's the foreign policies that you engage in our country, the kinds of foreign policies, the regimes that you support, the kind of aid that's given, or even when you mean well, the fact that you give it to an authoritarian regime when you know that even the economic aid will in fact not make it into the economy. It will be used for military, etc. That's what we're up against now as we move forward. And so what do we need to be thinking about? First of all, we need a new framework, and that's very threatening. We've had a framework for understanding the world. Part of the problem we had when the Soviet Union disappeared, as bad as it was and as much as we feared the Soviet Union was, in international relations, we had a black and white world. We knew who the bad guys were. We were the good guys, and we could put our policies out there with a certain sense of security. What happened after that fall? Most of the conflicts have actually been not state to state. It's been about ethnic, regional. It's been about asymmetric warfare. And that creates a gray world, a much, much more difficult world to deal with. Well, we had a framework in place. Okay. We used it during the Cold War, and we used it after the Cold War in the Muslim world. They may be bastards, but there are bastards. In other words, it's an unfair world, but in our national interest, it's regrettable, but to protect oil, access to oil, to protect the state of Israel, we're going to have to support these kinds of regimes. Okay. Now, if you need a new framework, it means it's going to be a framework that's going to be dicier. If you talk about self-determination, it means that you just might do some things that I don't like. Again, the analogy I often use is, the parent who says to the kid, "You're now grown up. I realize that. You've gone to high school, you've gone to college, you're still living at home, but you got to lead your own life. And he says that to his daughter or son, and then his daughter or son go to do something, and the parent says, but not in that topic. On this one, listen, you really got to operate this way. It's much better for you. And not on that topic, my wife often says of me, we don't have children, but she often says, if we had children, particularly if we had daughters, I'd be so protective that I wouldn't expect my daughter to move out. To which I say to my wife, by the way, I feel say this very proudly, a long-standing, in my own way, feminist, because the first book my wife gave me was The Feminine Mystique when the book was first published. That's a little different than a young Muslim friend of mine who called me up and said, Professor, can you help me? He said, there's this girl that I know, and she gave me this book, The Feminine Mystique. I said, well, what's the problem? He said, I have a lot of problem with the book. I figured, well, you might, but what's the problem? Most of we men do, whatever. He said, I've read about 30 pages, and there's nothing on Islamic mysticism. For him, mystique meant mysticism. I said, I think her message to you is just a little different. And if you want to continue to see her, read the book a little bit more closely. But the reality of it now is, as we go for this new framework, it means that self-determination really means that people have a right to choose their governments. We cannot do what we did when we went into Iraq. When we went into Iraq, we knew we wanted Ahmad Shalabi to be the guy to come in. When we went into Iraq, we were going to have a democracy, but we were going to define the nature of that democracy. We knew that society better than other people did. And we reconfigured a couple of times how that system of government would actually exist and move forward. When Hamas was elected in free and fair elections, most people said it was actually probably the freest elections ever held in the Arab world. We immediately backed away. And we engaged in indirect sanctions, etc. Okay? Now, if you're going to have free and fair elections, it means you're going to have political parties that develop. It means the outcome you can't guarantee. It means that the people are going to be somewhat independent. But we have examples. We look at modern Turkey. There has been a transformation in Turkey, but in general, Turkey has functioned better than previous governments with the European Union, with the U.S. The economy has improved. Yeah, there were problems, within Turkey as within any country, but we see that kind of movement. Well, the question is, can we move to that new framework? We're not used to that framework. Every time we see that framework, we're going to raise the age-old questions. But who will they elect? Will they be anti-American? Now, do we mean anti-American in a very literalist sense, or do we mean will they be people who do not simply accept or go along with everything that we want? Will the Islamists take power? I mean, this, for example, is brought up in countries where, if you look at most of these movements, the leadership has been very disparate. It has not been led by Islamist movements. Islamist movements have actually been in the background. People will say in Egypt, but the Muslim Brotherhood will come to power. Well, you got to take a closer look at the Muslim Brotherhood. If you believe everything you see on Fox and you see on websites instead of looking at empirical evidence, 40 years, Muslim Brotherhood has participated within the system to the extent that it can, nonviolently. When arrested, tortured, harassed, has not resorted to violence, has never resorted to violence. On the other hand, has been denounced by extremists, like Zawahiri, the number 2 person, etc. More importantly, how strong are these Islamist movements? Yes, they've been strong, but they've been strong in societies where there were no other political parties, no other options. And so when they receive votes not only from those who are their staunch supporters, but from those who've wanted to vote against the government. That's why Algeria turned out the way it did when it held parliamentary elections. That's why Egypt and Tunisia had problems they had. In other words, there's been an inflated number of votes, as it were, coming in, because this is the only game in town to vote. Most experts would say that in many cases, these groups, in terms of influence, can have significant influence, but 20–25% of the population. If you have a multi-party system and open and free elections, and in Egypt, the Brotherhood has also said that it would not run candidates for president, it would not take any senior government positions in the cabinet, in the next election. And so to allow people to say, but we somehow should be a little leery about supporting these pro-democracy movements. Now, the challenge for our government has been, though, how do you stay out ahead rather than following? How do we not dictate what is to happen, but how do we not make it look as if we have a government that's like this gorgeous liner. I'm showing my age here. The Queen Elizabeth, great liner, okay? And then when it becomes the Titanic, we still don't get off. As it definitely goes under, we then float to the top and say that we now support the people. And this has been the challenge of the administration. We've often sent mixed signals. Secretary of State Clinton, I'm staying at the Hill. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton winds up saying on the same day that the president says something, the Secretary of State says what a strong ally Bahrain is, how strongly we support Bahrain. At the same time, the president's saying that we support people's right for self-determination, to protest, etc. Very delicate balance there. And I think, we've realized that, and certainly that's the way it gets seen in the region. People don't want us to lead, but they are looking to see, are you going to continue to support these regimes critically? I think Obama has tried to counter that image by moving forward and making strong statements about calling up government leaders and saying that protesters should be safe from the violence committed by security forces and the military, etc. But we're still operating, and at some point we're going to have to step out forward probably a bit more. What do I mean specifically? Look at Egypt. In Egypt, who is taking care of Egypt's democratic future? The military. Okay. To be senior military in Egypt is to be acceptable to the Mubarak government, historically, and to the generals who are close to Mubarak, is to be part of a system. Many of the senior military are also big businessmen. They're part of the problem in terms of the elites. They are overseeing the transition. And so part of the challenge, you notice how there's a lot of nitpicking about who's on the transition team. Who's going to be in the positions that have leaders as you move towards elections, etc. And so this is going to be very tricky for the administration. The administration is going to have to be willing to go down the line if that's necessary, and avoid having a situation where the military finds ways to create a situation in which, when election time comes, who are the favored candidates, and who then winds up being elected. Bahrain is going to be very difficult. Bahrain, you have a majority of Shia and a minority of Sunni. But the Sunnis rule, and the Shia have real grievances. They've had them for 30 years. They continue to have those real grievances. There's going to have to be a significant shift. It's not going to be enough for Bahrain, for the monarch to do some of the little stuff that he wants to do. People are really going to press for more of what looks like a constitutional monarchy. One is going to have to be willing to deal with that. But we do have some allies that can help us along. Qatar is not a democracy, but Qatar has spoken out very strongly on the rights of people in the region to protest and to move towards greater power sharing, etc. That's one of our allies. We're going to have difficulty with Saudi Arabia and with our support for Saudi Arabia. Unless Saudi Arabia does more than just throw money, unless there's some increase in real power sharing, it's not that one is going to have to worry about a change anytime soon in Saudi Arabia. Not as far as I can tell. If that happens, you will doctor the tape, or you will destroy it. We'll discuss this after. But Saudi Arabia is going to have to acknowledge the kind of power sharing that's going to be necessary there. And it's going to have to deal more realistically with the issues that flow from that kind of power sharing. And we're going to see that in Yemen if it transitions. Yemen is the one that really is a wild card, as far as I can see. Because given the way the situation has been allowed to unfold, the kind of support we've given, and given the dangerous place that Yemen is, the guy we have there may be, as far as we can tell, the only game in town, but that's not going to wash for a lot of the protesters. So how one moves forward is going to be really very critical there. Let me end with the following observations. You wouldn't want to be President of the United States right now. Given the problem we have with the economy, with healthcare, with the recent elections, and with what's coming down down the pipe.